everybody. I don't often do this sort of webinar format, so I hope that you can see me and hear me okay. I'm doing this from our little media studio in my institute, because the webinars that I have participated in, you know, I just found that somebody sitting at their desk kind of staring into their iPad really didn't do it for me anyway. So I hope that this arrangement works for you guys. Please don't hesitate to interrupt if you need anything or what I'm saying isn't clear, you can't hear me. So I'm going to reprise a little bit of talk that I gave to the Mining Association of Nova Scotia, and it was as a result of that talk that I became a distinguished lecturer, as you mentioned, of the Mining Association. And it was, as the title implies, a talk about social license and the meaning of social license, and how social license as a concept relates to things like democracy and the rule of law. So I like to start by talking about the fact that we Canadians are people who have earned our way in the world by exploiting what I like to call the bounteous fruits of the earth, whether agricultural commodities, minerals, or oil and gas, and then transporting them to those who need them in every corner of the globe. And this vocation of developing and adding value to the wealth implicit in the earth is something of which I think we should all be inordinately proud. And it is a calumny on the Canadian character and our history to say that we are mere hewers of wood and drawers of water, as if knowing how to develop, enrich, and move the earth's riches well and intelligently were somehow an inferior occupation to others. Nothing could be further from the truth. But so often, I think we misunderstand or are unaware of why we are so good at this. And because we do not understand well our success, there are important dangers that hover over that success. And I'm going to try and illustrate the basic problem with a non-Canadian example that I happen to be familiar with. I used to work for the UN in Africa, in a country that used to be called Zaire and is now called the Democratic Republic of Congo. And during my time in Zaire, I became good friends with a successful Ismaili businessman who had built a lovely home in the hills, in the Rift Valleys in the east of the country, overlooking mist-covered lakes. It was really quite a spectacular spot. And one day, a Zairean army general drove up to the house and looked around appreciatively at the view. And he walked up to the door of the house and he knocked, and he said to my friend, "You have a beautiful home here. It's mine now. You have 24 hours to get out." Now, that appalling story isn't merely about arbitrary abuse of power in lawless lands. It happens to be about that, but it's also an object lesson in the incredible power of property rights and regulatory certainty and the rule of law to unlock prosperity, and conversely how their absence is so frequently the cause of the impoverishment of entire societies. My friend had the title to his land. He had honestly earned the money with which he built his house, but he lived in a society without the machinery to give his rights solidity. Men with guns could and did override his deed, and they overrode contracts and other legal rights with impunity. So few people could invest. Few people could risk investing in mines and pipelines and power plants and apartment buildings and dams and railways in the Congo. Only big international players who could afford their own armed men and who could bribe governments to leave them alone could afford to invest. And those ventures were highly risky, because who knew what would happen if the government fell or the president died? In fact, it is the weakness of property rights and regulatory certainty in such societies that is at the root, for example, of the environmental degradation that so often accompanies development in those countries. Why is that? Because in the absence of reliable and enforceable rights, if your tenure can be yanked out from under you on a whim, as a rational risk manager, you have to assume that if it can happen, it will happen. And the only possible response to those incentives are to rape and pillage the earth to recover your investment as quickly as you possibly can. Only in circumstances where you can be confident that your tenure is secure, that you know the rules and that the rules will be enforced, can you take the time and invest the money that allows responsible development to occur. But what about this idea that the value of our natural resources doesn't come from the resources themselves? Otherwise, places like Russia and Congo and Angola and Indonesia with fine natural resource endowments would be rich like Canada. But they're not. Instead, what we have in Canada and what they don't have is a natural resource endowment which is nested within a much more important endowment of institutions, of rules, of laws, and behaviors that have created the certainty that unlocks the investment on which the natural resource economy depends. So what is this institutional endowment? It's the rule of law, it's democracy, it's judicial independence, it's robust property rights, it's respect of contracts, it's speedy and authoritative dispute resolution, it's non-corrupt police and bureaucracy, it's a relatively stable regulatory and tax burden, it's non-violent resolution of disagreements, it's a strong work ethic, and many more things besides. So the natural resource economy is thus heavily dependent on the certainty that our institutions create. And that is both why we have been so successful compared to other places in developing that natural resource endowment. And it is also why recent developments that call that certainty into question are so troubling, because they gnaw at the very root of our success. And that's where we get to the issue of social license. But before we talk about social license, think about this for a minute. Why is it that the natural resource economy represents only about 12 or 13% of the national economy? It's about the same size as manufacturing. Manufacturing is about 15%. The rest, 70%, is services. Why is it that the natural resource economy, representing only 12, 13, 14% of the national economy, represents 1/2 of all the business investment intentions in Canada? So this 12, 13% of the economy represents 1/2 of all the business investment intentions. Why? Because natural resources require huge investments up front with a payback period measured in decades. In order to play in this game, you have to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars up front on a mine, on an oil sands plant, on an LNG terminal or a pipeline, and then you have to hope that the price of the commodity that you're producing and all the other uncontrollable variables come together over 30 years to allow you to recoup your investment. Just take one example. I think last year, the announcement was made that a final investment decision had been taken in favor of an LNG terminal on the west coast of Canada, on British Columbia's coast. I don't know if any of you followed that story, but I believe that the official number is that investment is going to be $41 billion. $41 billion to build one LNG plant and its associated infrastructure. That's why uncertainty in our institutions is so devastating to the natural resource economy in particular, because the decision to invest the money up front is highly sensitive to the conditions of the day. Investment won't be made in a place where that sort of certainty is not available. So the next concept that I want to introduce is what I call the perishable nature of opportunity. The natural resource opportunity facing Canada, or facing the world, is huge, and it will last for decades, regardless of the short-term movement of crisis. But I want to be very clear that the opportunities for specific projects, like that LNG plant that I mentioned, are extremely dependent on the circumstances at any given moment. For example, Japan, as many of you may know, is closing down an important part of its nuclear power industry following the Fukushima nuclear accident. That opens a window for the suppliers of natural gas who can build the infrastructure and make long-term contractual commitments to get that gas to Japan to fuel the natural gas-fired plants that will take nuclear's place. In that race, there will be winners and there will be losers. Those who cannot deliver on time and on budget will lose, and the opportunity will be gone for a very long time because those natural gas contracts are going to last for decades. This was certainly the case in the Mackenzie Valley, where the natural gas pipeline that was proposed took a decade to get approval, but by the time that approval was finally forthcoming, market conditions had shifted and the window had closed, to the immense frustration of many Northerners, including many Aboriginal people who had acquired a 1/3 interest in the Mackenzie Valley pipeline project. And that is an object lesson in the perishable nature of opportunity and in how local enthusiasm is no longer a guarantee of a project's success. Having a great natural resource endowment is not enough. It's not enough. If you don't have reliable and predictable institutions that give us access to the minerals and other resources that are to be developed. And that reliability or certainty has in recent years been severely called into question. And I've only got time today to speak to one of the causes of that rising uncertainty, but is the one that is causing me the most concern as I contemplate the future of the natural resource economy in Canada, and that is the social license movement. The social license movement matters because its rise goes right to the heart of the certainty that I'm arguing needs to characterize the institutional framework that we put around the natural resource industry. It used to be that the framework for development of natural resources was pretty clear. Governments generally owned the resource. They set a regulatory and a tax and a royalty framework that was pretty clear and stable. Developers knew in advance what the rules were that had to be satisfied in order to be granted permission to proceed. Regulatory proceedings, like, for example, the National Energy Board hearings on pipelines, were not intended to be a place where the desirability of development per se was to be debated. They were instead an evidence-based technical inquiry about whether project proponents had satisfied the regulatory requirements in order to be given a green light. And all of this occurred within a climate of public opinion that generally held that well-designed and well-run natural resource development was in the public interest. That long-standing political development, political consensus, is breaking down all around us. And with it, the confidence in and deference towards our generally excellent regulatory proceedings. And while this breakdown is most obvious in the oil and gas sector, the rest of the natural resource sector is not immune. The obstacles to reasoned development of our resources, including forest, hydropower, and minerals and their attendant infrastructure, are becoming ever more daunting. And I think it's safe to predict that the sector's opponents will continue their slow ratcheting up of opposition to development on an increasingly broad front. Indeed, I would go further and make the case that the old consensus is breaking down largely due to increasingly vocal minorities who are opposed to natural resource development per se, and are now using the institutions we created with the thought that we were creating an orderly and thoughtful approval process. These highly motivated minorities are using those institutions to ensure a disorderly and emotional process. One of the most devastating criticisms of Bill C-69, which we heard so much in the lead up to the current election, in my view, is the extent to which it licenses a large increase in the scope of both the topics and the interests on which consultation is to be made mandatory, and the legitimizing of an endless and limitless consultative process as, in effect, not a way to win approval for projects, but a way to obstruct them almost without limitation. One of the greatest challenges we face in continuing our great tradition of success in the natural resource sector, then, in my opinion, is the undermining of the institutions that surround decisions about development. As long as we continue to fight a rearguard action in defense of individual projects, I believe we will always be on the defensive, and increasingly, we will see projects fail as a result. Wherever there is organized opposition to new pipeline, mines, railroads, manufacturing plants, container terminals, or tree cutting, to mention just a few examples, the opponents repeat the mantra that such projects must obtain social license or they must not be allowed. So let's turn now to the central concept of social license. Despite the widespread assumption that social license is indispensable, no one seems to be able to answer a few basic questions about such license. What, for instance, is the address to which you need to write in order to obtain social license? What form do you have to fill out? Who are the authorities who decide if your application meets the rules, and to whom are those authorities accountable? In fact, what are the rules that you're trying to satisfy? What are the procedures followed in determining if you do satisfy them? What appeal procedures exist if a project proponent feels their project has not been fairly assessed? Now, if you're like most people, these questions will make you smile, because you and I both know there are no answers to these questions. But they're not silly questions. They're not silly questions. On the contrary, they go right to the heart of how a democratic society that lives under the rule of law operates. The very vagueness of the term social license means that we cannot know what the rules are. You cannot know when you're in compliance or when you still have work to do. And project opponents like that vagueness just fine, because it gives them unilateral authority to claim that the need for social license has not been met. How can they be proven wrong, since no one knows the tests that must be satisfied? Now, change, and particularly economic change, always creates winners and losers. And that's why we hedge economic development around with many restrictions and requirements, including the need to consult and the need to accommodate people whose legitimate interests may be damaged, including, quite properly, Aboriginal people. We must minimize any unavoidable harms to the greatest extent possible. We must also meet the highest environmental standards while seeking to maintain the consent of the population. But we also have to balance the costs against the benefits that development may create in terms of jobs, business, investment, and opportunity. And in a civilized society, we create numerous institutions that are domiciled at known addresses, that are given specific authority to examine impartially the issues that development raises, according to known rules. Outfits like the National Energy Board or various federal and provincial environmental assessment agencies. The purpose of these regulatory and administrative proceedings is precisely to create a fair setting where all relevant information is gathered and independent and disinterested commissioners ask themselves what a reasonable person would conclude about the balance between the costs and benefits of the project before them. Moreover, administrative tribunals such as the NEB or the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, environmental assessment panels, and others are accountable to the governments that appoint them, as well as to the courts, to whom aggrieved parties may appeal when they think the rules have been broken. The legislators who pass the laws creating these agencies must submit themselves periodically to the verdict of the voters. The rules generally require public consultations of some kind and compensation for damaged interests. After a detailed and extensive consultation process, the NEB granted a permit to the Northern Gateway Pipeline, to pick that example, to proceed subject to 209 conditions. 209 conditions. In other words, after the proponents for the Northern Gateway Pipeline had done everything they thought was necessary to satisfy the rules, the NEB came back and said, here's 209 extra things beyond what you already planned to do that we are asking you to do in order to be approved to build this pipeline. Those 209 conditions were designed to respond to Canadians' rising expectations around the stringency of approvals for such major projects. Canadians want to know that these projects are meeting the strictest tests. Smart developers want local support for their plans. Politicians want developments that win public support rather than alienate voters. And the institutions that I am describing help to achieve this. And if that is what is meant by social license, that once you get through this clear, objective process subject to the rule of law, in which people whose interests are damaged are fully compensated and so forth, when people get through that process, they may be said to have gained social license. Who could possibly object? Ordinary, reasonable people want to be reassured that the properly constituted authorities, including the proponents and the companies that want to build these projects, are applying reasonable standards in making such momentous decisions. And I would make the case that people who make it through these onerous, demanding, and internationally admired regulatory processes here in Canada are the ones who have social license in the legitimate sense. But of course, the extreme social license advocates have been working overtime in recent years to undermine the credibility of the institutions that I have just described. Institutions that we have created democratically to manage these decisions on behalf of Canadians. Yet despite what you may have heard, these institutions have not been turned into pushovers, toadying up to project proponents and ignoring the rising expectations of Canadians with respect to environmental protection and other standards. On the contrary, despite some of the rhetoric deployed in not this federal election, but the previous federal election, for example, there is little objective evidence that Canada's regulatory system has failed or needs to be tougher. Energy installations, mines, hydro transmissions facilities, some decades old, work day in and day out without incident, including the original, of course, Kinder Morgan pipeline, approved in one day of hearings by the NEB in the 1950s and still operating safely and highly successfully today, decades later. Other countries hold up our regulators as models to emulate. The new federal government, well, not so new anymore, the Liberal government elected in 2015, criticized the previous government, the Harper government, for reforms to the regulatory process to make it more efficient, ignoring the fact that demands for just such reforms came most notably from Indigenous groups in the Northwest Territories, burned by the failure of the interminable Mackenzie Valley pipeline hearings to which I referred earlier in my talk. The proponents of full-blooded social license dismiss this sort of defense of our institutions as mere legalism. According to them, some abstract and ill-defined entity called society, independent of regulators, independent of courts, independent of legislatures, must be satisfied, or else it is illegitimate to build the mine or the pipeline or the plant or the road or the railroad. But as I hope I've made clear, these claims actually constitute an attack on the institutions and behaviors which are Canada's greatest endowment. And the uncertainty thus created is undermining the value of our natural resources and causing us to forego opportunities that undermine our prosperity. And these claims do more than just constitute an attack on the rule of law, thanks to their lack of due process and natural justice, for example. They constitute an attack on democracy because they don't just attempt to intimidate legitimate political and regulatory institutions. Some of you may recall that the NEB held some hearings in Montreal that had to be shut down because they were literally invaded by people in masks, shouting and preventing the hearings from taking place, in spite of the fact that they were completely legitimate and legal proceedings under the laws of Canada. So this social license movement, the extreme social license movement, constitutes an attack on democracy because they don't just attempt to intimidate these institutions operating within the democratic rules of our society, who are called upon to make such difficult decisions. They refuse to recognize the fundamental legitimacy of those institutions. Unless those institutions come to the same conclusion that these extreme social license advocates come to about individual projects, then the work of those institutions is to be discarded and indeed denigrated as obviously the work of the hand puppets of rapacious capitalism. Now, I want to be very clear. There is nothing undemocratic about saying that you think the processes used to make such decisions ought to be changed, and submitting your ideas to political parties and the voters. It is entirely legitimate to go to court to question whether the law is being correctly, fairly, and properly applied. It is equally democratic to voice your displeasure about proposed projects, to demonstrate against them, to threaten politicians with a loss of support if they go ahead. That's all fair game, and it's part of the process by which politicians get feedback about how the rules should be framed and what is publicly acceptable. What is wholly undemocratic, however, is to say that you simply disregard the decisions of duly constituted constitutional and democratic authority as without merit or foundation, as if your views are the only ones that deserve to be heard or taken account of. Now, sometimes social license takes the rather different form of claiming that people far away shouldn't have an important say on decisions that have a different impact on locals, and therefore that social license is something that must be conferred by those who have the most at stake. Moreover, if the economic benefits are to be enjoyed more by the far away than by the locals, that license's extortion of the faraway interests or social license will not be forthcoming. If the argument is that those who benefit must pay all the costs of their project, including the highest standards of environmental protection and of any cleanup required by a failure of those protections and compensation for legitimate interest damage, I think I scarcely need say that such things are the hallmarks of a civilized society and can and must be done. But again, these things must be determined by an independent and evidence-based process, not on the basis of orchestrated and exaggerated fear and emotion. And indeed, in the case of Northern Gateway, again, to pick that example, that is precisely what many of the 209 conditions I mentioned were designed to ensure, that the project has confronted all these issues and have offered reasoned and reasonable answers to the foreseeable risks and dangers that the project might give rise to. Once these legitimate claims are recognized and honored, however, vital projects cannot be held hostage to every grasping local interest. The St. Lawrence Seaway benefits some communities hugely. Other communities are benefited not at all, and for yet others who were flooded to make it possible, as there are a number in the St. Lawrence Valley, it was a death sentence. Railways pass through hundreds of communities in Canada where they never stop. And yet those communities run the risk of noise pollution, collisions, and catastrophic spills of chemicals and other toxic substances. People who live next to airports are surely inconvenienced by the noise and traffic. But we don't allow provinces or communities or disaffected groups to throw up customs booths at their borders and collect taxes to allow them to get what they judge to be their fair share of other people's goods as they pass through, or to prevent them from carrying on their lawful activity. That's what countries too often do to each other. And the result is the collective impoverishment of the world. And we are busily engaged in a massive effort to try and tear down those barriers so that other countries cannot object to the importation of our goods and services on the grounds that such transactions benefit Canadians more than citizens in those other places. We rightly regard it as a great victory for Canada that we have just negotiated a free trade agreement with the European Union and renewed NAFTA with the US, for example, that will prevent local European and American industries and politicians from obstructing access to their markets for Canadian products, claiming that Canadians have not been granted social license to threaten local livelihoods. Now, some may want to make the case that specific communities or provinces get shortchanged in the benefits generated by individual projects. That's a perfectly legitimate position to take. But holding up projects that benefit the whole province or country simply because you think you haven't got your fair share, whatever that is the precise logic of protectionists and NIMBYists everywhere. That unless each transaction can demonstrably be shown to benefit us more than other parties to the transaction, we will block it. Not because blocking it will help us, but because we would rather be poor together than to see anyone else get ahead. So what the proponents of what I call the mob rule version of social license really mean to say is that change must be approved by its opponents. Change must be approved by its opponents. And it's the project's opponents who decide whether social license has been achieved. While the absence of social license is allegedly demonstrated by angry media releases or hand-lettered signs waved on the evening news. Increasingly, therefore, in my view, social license ought properly to be called opponent's permission. Opponent's permission. And a moment's thought, I think, will reveal why such open-ended, undefined, biased, undemocratic, and unaccountable tests can never be the basis on which civilized societies make such decisions. Now, I want to turn briefly, and I think I have the time, take another maybe 10 minutes or so. I want to turn to a related issue briefly, which is the role of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in developing Canada's natural resources. Some people see in the enormous political, judicial, and constitutional success of Indigenous people in asserting their treaty and Aboriginal rights a threat similar to the uncertainty created by the social license movement. I want to make it crystal clear that I believe these two things are not similar at all. They are not similar at all. Indigenous rights in Canada are recognized in the Constitution, in treaties, and in Aboriginal rights and titles. These are not outside the law. They are at the heart of the law as it has been developing in Canada for centuries, and particularly in the last 30 years since the constitutional reforms of 1982. So I hope I'm heading off at the pass any impression that people may have formed that in criticizing the extreme social license movement, I am taking aim at increased Indigenous authority in natural resource decision-making. On the contrary, my criticism of the social license movement is not directed at the legitimate exercise of lawful requirements that Aboriginal people's interests must be consulted and accommodated. Indeed, my institute's largest project is focused on exactly how that can be made to happen in a way that benefits Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people together, so that the natural resource economy becomes a platform for reconciliation, not division. That does not mean that there are not occasions when Indigenous people have appealed to the concept of social license in attempts to derail certain projects. As my colleague Dwight Newman, who's Canada Research Chair in the Law Faculty at University of Saskatchewan, has effectively argued, Aboriginal people's use of the social license concept is likely a strategic and tactical mistake. And social license is already being used by minorities and Aboriginal communities to thwart natural resource developments approved and supported by those communities. So I'm arguing that the wrong kind of social license is just as harmful to the legitimate aspirations of Indigenous communities as it is to the larger economy. And Indigenous people make an important error when they base their claims to full consultation on this extra legal concept of social license as opposed to their completely legitimate rights and authorities under the Constitution, the law, and treaties. Now, it would be foolish to assert that there have been no uncertainties created along the way as we seek to integrate Indigenous rights into the regulatory framework surrounding the natural resource economy. But I would say that, contrary to a widespread view, that we have made huge progress with more on the horizon. The challenge we have before us then is how do we fully integrate the power and authority Aboriginal people now enjoy over natural resource development in a way that makes them full partners in development and decision making while unlocking perishable opportunities when they are ripe. How do we make the power and authority that Indigenous people quite properly and legitimately enjoy an integral part of the endowment of institutions that I referred to earlier, making Aboriginal authority a matter of certainty rather than uncertainty? Make no mistake, Aboriginal peoples are asking themselves these very questions. Let me quote to you from a recent op-ed by Stephen Buffalo, the head of the Indian Resource Council. Stephen, who has written on these issues for my institute and is a senior fellow at my institute, had this to say in the National Post in the context of the debate over the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. He said, when pipeline opponents use the courts to slow or stop pipelines, they undermine our businesses, that is to say Indigenous businesses. They eliminate jobs in our communities. They have reduced the amount of money flowing to our government. But there are lessons for all Canadians in the Trans Mountain decision. Indigenous rights mean something. Consultation has to be real, robust, and meaningful. This does not mean every Indigenous community will get everything they want out of every development project. We understand and respect the authority of the Government of Canada and its mandate to address the needs of other Canadians. But our rights are meaningful and powerful. There are no shortcuts around the duty to consult and accommodate. We have the right to be heard. We have the right to be part of the solution to the challenges facing Canadian resource developers. This works. Our communities are partners with hundreds of oil and gas and transmission companies across the country. Our resource-active communities are gaining autonomy from governments and showing that we will be an active and progressive part of this country's economic future. He said, I think this is terribly important, please do not hold Indigenous people to a double standard, as Canadians have done often in the past. Some First Nations oppose oil and gas development, others do not, just like other Canadians. After all, it was opposition by the City of Montreal, not Indigenous groups, that helped kill the Energy East pipeline project. Indigenous people are sick and tired of being seen as a problem for Canada. We understand that Canada's prosperity can and should be good for Indigenous people. Canadians need to appreciate that our prosperity is good for Canada too. So in wrapping up, I want to build on what Stephen has said in the case of Trans Mountain, but which I believe is increasingly true of Aboriginal involvement in the natural resource economy generally. Forward-looking Aboriginal communities will soon be the indispensable allies of the natural resource industry. And I say this in part because I've seen recent polling data that says that while the credibility and authority of politicians and regulators and companies is at a low ebb in the minds of the public when it comes to convincing them that development is environmentally responsible, the same is not true of Indigenous people. When Indigenous communities do their due diligence and support natural resource projects because they're both environmentally responsible and unlock opportunity, the public tends to be highly supportive. And that means that Indigenous people now occupy a strategic political ground. If they side with the environmental opposition to development and the extreme version of the social license movement, development will face almost insurmountable odds. When Aboriginal people exercise their right to full involvement in development and then lend their voice to support these important opportunities, the chances of overcoming other forms of opposition are greatly increased. A great deal of attention has been focused in the media on instances when First Nations have said no to development, such as the famous case of the community that said no to over $1 billion by refusing to allow the siting of an LNG terminal on Laylu Island on the BC coast. I would argue that this is the exception rather than the rule, and in any case is not the final word on that project. What you may not have heard is that the neighboring First Nation, the Nisga'a in the Nass Valley, responded to the decision on Laylu Island by going out and spending their own money to identify 5 sites on their territory that they argued were well suited to an LNG terminal, and that they would be pleased to host such a development on their traditional territory. The Nisga'a also asked to be exempted from the offshore tanker ban. Now, before Parliament because as a coastal community, they hoped and expected to benefit from hosting the ocean terminal of Northern Gateway for its successor. The point I'm making is that First Nations have the power to say yes, which they are exercising more frequently than you may imagine, and that they are doing so by exercising their rights that the Supreme Court has recognized, that the Crown has a duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous interests where they are engaged by decisions of the Crown. Think about this in the context of the federal government, which announced without consultation, without study, and without support of experts knowledgeable in the field, they decided to ban oil tanker traffic off the northern BC coast. Given the economic stakes and the number of Aboriginal communities also already engaged in various pipeline and other projects that require access to such shipping, I was not in the least surprised to learn that First Nations are quite properly dragging the federal government to court for having so egregiously trampled on their rights and opportunities without consultation. New pro-development alliances are forming even now, and they will give the lie to the widespread narrative that Aboriginal Canada is anti-development. Another good example is the First Nations Major Project Coalition. Coalition was conceived to respond to the capacity issues faced by many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities whose relatively small number of residents makes it hard for them to possess by themselves all the information, expertise, and capital needed to develop their economic opportunities. The coalition offers a framework for nearly 50 First Nations to work collaboratively, sharing resources on a case-by-case basis to examine major project proposals. More communities are asking to join the coalition every week. This is not pie in the sky. All these things are happening now. There has been a record number of deals done in recent years with First Nations over resource development across Canada. 3 different Indigenous-led groups are seeking to buy the Keystone expansion project, the Trans Mountain project, either in its entirety or as a significant partner. If we focus more on the opportunities that bind us together than the obstacles we face in developing these opportunities, I believe we will get through this together. And when we do, we will have helped bring Aboriginal people into full participation in Canadian society and the economy, while reining in the unaccountable and unmerited power of the extreme social license movement. And that, ladies and gentlemen, would be no mean achievement. That's what I wanted to say to you today, and I welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crowley. That was a very interesting presentation, and I appreciate your time. If anybody has any questions or comments that they would like to make, then respond in the chat or just feel free to unmute and participate in the discussion.
Hello, this is Dave Corrival calling in from Calgary.
Hi, Dave.
Hello. Yeah, it was very interesting, Dr. Crowley, and useful, informative, etc. So I guess I liked your notion of, rather than having a social license stop rate kind of haphazardly proclaimed, this notion of gaining opponents' permission, because I like that because it reflects good accountability. I'm just curious, any thoughts on where something like that might reside? I don't want to make more bureaucracy, but I'm saying, which body would it sit in? The federal, the provincial, you know, that sort of thing, or in the courts? Like, what qualifies in you? And I know it's hypothetical, but as somebody who's to raise their hand, fine, I'm not the society, but I'm a permitted opponent, or whatever we want to call it. I just like the idea.
Well, look, David, you see, you might have noticed in my talk that I made reference to the fact that the way things are set up now, we're essentially fighting a rearguard action in defense of individual projects. Every time an individual project is brought to the table, you know, the social license movement organizes and turns out, and all the things that I described happen. I think that as long as we're fighting this rearguard action, if we don't take on the extreme social license movement in an organized way, if we're simply trying to fight them off in the case of each individual project, I think we will lose more than we will win. So I think we actually need to think about this quite differently. I think what we need to do is we need to recognize that the traditional national consensus that existed in Canada in favor of thoughtful, well-regulated, and environmentally responsible natural resource development. That consensus is breaking down. And we need to think about how to put that consensus back together. And you can't do that by, trying to respond to the social license advocates at hearings for, Keystone XL or Kinder Morgan or whatever. We have to take a step back from the individual project. We have to remember that, Canadians had this quite favorable consensus toward responsible natural resource development because they believed in the institutions that we had created, and they believed that politicians and judges and regulators acted responsibly and the rules were good. I think people have lost that confidence, and we need to rebuild it. And I think that the way to do that, the closest example I can think of, something similar. Some of you, I'm sure I'm the oldest person on this webinar, so I'm sorry to say I remember. I don't know if anybody else does. Back when the current Prime Minister's father was Prime Minister, he appointed Don MacDonald to run a royal commission on what was called Canada's Economic Prospects. Became known as the MacDonald Royal Commission. And one of the things that the MacDonald Royal Commission did was they engaged in a bit of an act of national psychotherapy. They spent 2 years traveling the country talking about the idea of free trade with the United States. Now, politicians for a century in Canada had been terrified at the idea of touching the concept of free trade with the United States because they all remembered that in the 1911 election, Wilfrid Laurier went down to a crushing defeat at the hands of Robert Borden when Laurier was making the election about a free trade agreement he had negotiated with the United States. So there was a century of political prejudice against free trade. There was anxiety about America sort of taking over and dominating and buying everything and so on. And the MacDonald Royal Commission spent a long time looking at the issues calmly and rationally and holding these public hearings, consulting the experts. And by the time they were done, they made free trade something that Canadians could get behind, even though just a few years before, they'd been very skeptical about it. I think we need to think in a systematic way now about how we need to do something similar for the natural resource economy so that we can restore Canadians' confidence in the system, so that we can convince them that the way we do this is the way that they would do it if they were in charge, that they would recognize it as responsible, honest, thoughtful, evidence-based, et cetera, so that when the individual projects then come forward and the social license movement turns out, ordinary Canadians will say, well, wait a minute, I remember we had a conversation about, okay, let's get agreement here in Canada about what the rules should look like if we're going to have natural resource projects. And we came up with a set of rules that seemed to me to be pretty reasonable. So if you're now saying, well, we can't allow this to happen because it doesn't have social license, no, I'm sorry, we agreed to these rules. And if this project meets the rules that we all agree to, we're in favor. I mean, I think that's still the case. You still see, even in British Columbia, you still see a majority of people, for example, in favor of the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion. But that majority support is not being realized, is not being effective in the political system anymore. And we need to find ways to change that. And what I've described, I think, is probably the best way to do it. If not that, it's got to be something similar.
I like it. Thank you. Very helpful.
Anybody else got anything?
Are there any other questions for Dr. Crowley?
If there's none, I'm just thinking about, I like the idea of a royal commission, but I'm curious how many proponents you might have for something, I don't know, that maybe has a quicker tagline like a consensus emergency.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I'm going to steal that if you don't mind. and by the way, I didn't mean to suggest it has to be a royal commission. That one happened to be a royal commission. I was focusing more on what they achieved rather than the fact that it was a royal commission per se.
No, I hear that. That's why I say whatever mechanism. I was just because I am perplexed. This is something that should speak to frankly, to the hearts and minds of all Canadians, because the irresponsible stewardship of natural resources, to which we, as you indicated, we are so blessed, could stand the risk of maybe not becoming like Zaire, but unchecked, unwatched, unguarded. They're easy for others to take. That's it.
Well, yeah, and I wish I could say that this was a hypothetical concern of mine. It's not. When you look at, you remember I said that the natural resource economy represents 12, 13, 14% of the national economy, but represents 1/2 of all business intentions. You don't need to look any further than that for an explanation of why foreign investment in Canada has been taking a nosedive. It's because nobody outside Canada thinks that Canada is a safe, reliable place in which to put billions of dollars to develop natural resources. They just don't believe. This is especially true, of course, in the oil and gas industry. Mining is not nearly as damaged, but I have to say, I think that's only because the social license movement hasn't drawn a bead on the mining industry yet. That will come. They've already done tremendous damage to the forestry industry. They're now focused on the oil and gas industry. I have to say that these are people who, by and large, in my experience, don't support natural resource development. They think these things should be left exactly as nature created them. I happen to think that is one of Canada's great contributions to the world, that we know how to develop nature's bounty responsibly. And I don't think we should give this up lightly.
This Broussard, one of the things that I see as an issue that perhaps wasn't around when Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister is what I call the disease of social media, whereby you're guilty as charged, and that people just don't climb onto a bandwagon because a few thousand people who have computers and nothing better to do click on Facebook that they like it. So that's something that's easily creates a snowball effect. And of course, the environmental lunatics out there grab onto that right away. Plus, they don't need to reveal where their funding comes from. And a good lot of the funding, my understanding, from articles by probably Gwyn Morgan more than anybody else in the National Post, come from large U.S. Trusts who are supported by large U.S. companies. So anyway, let's not get into that because it's not totally proven. But that seems to me as a major obstacle in trying to move back to democracy, because essentially social media is anti-democratic.
Yes, I have to say I think there's a lot of merit in your comments about social media. I'm a real fervent advocate of free speech. I don't think that social media should be regulated. I don't think anybody should be telling you what you can say on social media. But one of the things about a society that really believes in free speech is that there's two dimensions to it. There's the people talking and there's the people listening. To say that you're free to say something doesn't mean that we are compelled to believe it. And I think we have to be a little more skeptical about the things that are said, most obviously on social media, but in lots of other places. I read some of the accounts. People say, well, I'm opposed to such and such a development because if it goes ahead, it'll be the end of life as we've known it on Earth. I think, really? I mean, the evidence doesn't seem to back this up. And yet, thousands of people may endorse this on social media. And one of the things that's been happening in one of the ways in which the extreme social license movement has been causing our regulatory system to break down is they're able to use social media to reach people all across the globe instantaneously. And so when the National Energy Board, for example, on some of these pipeline projects has opened a period in which they invite public comment, they've been getting comments from thousands of people around the world, from Brazil, from China, from Indonesia, all essentially parroting the talking points of activists here in Canada, and creating the impression that there is some kind of worldwide movement identifying Canada as some kind of eco-criminal, and begging Canada not to allow these developments to take place. We simply have to be more critical and more thoughtful about what we regard as useful input into the regulatory system. I think we're going in the opposite direction, and I think it's really going to come back to haunt us.
Are there any other questions or comments for Dr. Crowley this morning or afternoon? Going once, going twice. Okay, well, if there's nothing else from anybody, I would like to thank you again, Dr. Crowley, for taking your time to share this with us. Again, it was very interesting.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for asking.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye now.